Hey everyone, this is Pete, and today I'd like to talk about why the Atari 2600 is important. Retro gaming comes in many flavours, and most people who involve themselves in the hobby quickly develop their own preferences. Some prefer more recent retro titles that can be more directly related to the games we're still playing today, while others prefer looking further back to admire aspects of gaming that are less commonly seen today, such as the artistry of pixel graphics designed within strict technical limitations. Some retro enthusiasts have trouble looking back beyond a certain point, however. They might respect the origins of the video games medium, but have little desire to engage with early titles. That's fine, as everyone has their own priorities, and no one can be reasonably expected to play every game in existence, given the sheer number of them that are readily accessible to this day. But I must admit I do find it a little bit galling when people are outright dismissive of early games and tech, often on the grounds that they haven't aged well. What people really mean when they say that is, I can't deal with graphics that primitive, therefore I'm not going to bother even trying to explore early games, even out of curiosity. And that's why we're here today. I didn't grow up with the Atari 2600, as by the time I was aware of video games, my whole family were already dedicated users of the much more advanced Atari 8-bit and ST home computers. But in more recent years, thanks to a combination of retro compilations like Atari Flashback Classics and Atari 50, and dedicated retro gaming platforms like the Evercade, I've been exploring the Atari 2600's library in a lot more detail than ever before. And not only do I very much like what I've found, it's become very clear to me that if you really want to understand gaming, you should take some time to understand the Atari 2600 and its vast catalogue of games. The Atari 2600, or as it was originally known, the Atari Video Computer System or VCS, first launched in North America in September of 1977. It was not the first video games machine, as numerous arcade games had previously been released by this point, following the pioneering Computer Space in 1971 and Pong in 1972. It was not the first TV-connected video games machine, as the Magnavox Odyssey had that covered as far back as 1972, and Atari themselves released numerous standalone adaptations of many of their arcade games for the home. It wasn't even the first TV-connected video games console to use a microprocessor and use interchangeable ROM cartridges rather than having games built in, as the Fairchild Channel F beat Atari to the punch in 1976. But it was the first TV-connected video games console to use a microprocessor and interchangeable ROM cartridges that really found success in family homes, particularly in North America. It successfully popularised the idea of video games as an activity for everyone, initially placing a particular focus on gaming as something that the whole family could engage with and enjoy together. Early games like Combat provided an action-packed means for friends and family members to get directly competitive with one another. Digital adaptations of board games like video chess and checkers allowed families to enjoy classic pastimes gathered around the television in their living room, rather than having to find space for their analogue counterparts. And games like video pinball specifically marketed themselves as a means of enjoying the fun of arcades without having to leave the house, spend your pocket change, or indeed spend time in an environment that some might find undesirable or uncomfortable. Probably the most interesting thing about the Atari 2600 is that it was released at a time where everyone was still mulling over the exact definition of what a video game really was. What kind of experiences would people like to have on a games console? Did they want a simple means of taking analogue group activities such as board, card and parlour games into the digital realm? Did they want there to be some educational value to the experience, or should the focus purely be on entertainment? Did they want the opportunity to explore new types of interactive experience that would only be possible with the assistance of their games console? Or did they want the chance to bring the arcade home and enjoy at least a rough approximation of games that could otherwise only be played under very specific circumstances? The answer is yes. People wanted all of those things. Video games were a new and exciting medium, and they provided seemingly endless possibilities. It didn't matter that the visuals on the screen bore relatively little relation to reality. Books, radio programs, TV shows, comics and all manner of other media had trained everyone to use their imagination to fill in the blanks. And so while a modern gamer might see something like 1980s adventure as a flickery mess of coloured blocks, back in the day it was an epic quest through dank dungeons and perilous labyrinths. Early Atari 2600 games acted more as a means of facilitating fun, rather than being a completely self-contained experience. This was partly down to the fact that games are crammed into just 2 or 4K of ROM, but also partly by design. In many cases, particularly games for 2 or more players, the Atari 2600 essentially acted as a replacement for a game board and pieces, and assumed that those playing together would naturally interact with one another atop the foundation the games provided. That's why early 2-player games like Air Sea Battle feature relatively little fanfare when someone wins or loses. It was assumed, probably correctly, that the players would bring their own rewards, forfeits and competitive structure to the experience as they desired. Indeed, some early Atari 2600 games, including the classic Combat, could only be played by 2 players. But some designers recognised that part of the appeal of a computerised gaming system was the possibility of a digital opponent. And so, games like Canyon Bomber helped demonstrate the value of a solid single-player experience. This concept carried over into Atari 2600 adaptations of more traditional games, and this really helped to prove the value of the console to many players. Now, not only could it be used as a simple means of enjoying classic experiences such as chess and checkers with family and friends, it could also be used as a means for a solo player to practice, or simply to play without having to bother other people. Likewise, digital adaptations of sports provided the opportunity not only for people to play together, but also for solo players to enjoy the experience of virtual tennis, baseball, American football and soccer against a similarly virtual opponent. You'll notice that thus far we've primarily been looking at Atari's own games. These are extremely important to the Atari 2600's history for sure, but one of the main ways in which the console distinguished itself from its predecessors is in third-party support, as previous efforts such as the Fairchild Channel F only played host to games made by the console's own manufacturer. The idea of the third-party video game developer came about as a number of disgruntled Atari employees, frustrated at the company's policy of not crediting its programmers for their creations or providing them with royalties, departed and formed their own collective. It was understandable. The developers David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead had, between them, produced games that accounted for 60% of Atari's sales. They felt that Atari should treat developers in the same way that record labels treated musicians, providing them with royalties and prominent credits on game boxes. Ray Kassar, Atari's CEO at the time, did not agree, referring to the Gang of Four, as they had become known, as towel designers, and claiming that anybody can do a cartridge. Quite reasonably upset at this turn of events, Crane, Miller and Kaplan left Atari in August of 1979, with Whitehead following shortly afterwards. After securing about $1 million in venture capital, including potential litigation fees to deal with the inevitable backlash from Atari, the group formed a company that was initially given the placeholder name Computer Arts Incorporated. Their investor and CEO Jim Levy suggested combining the words active and television to form the name Activision, and it stuck. Since Crane, Kaplan, Miller and Whitehead were all Atari veterans, they knew exactly how to make the Atari 2600 sing. And as such, it didn't take long for Activision games to distinguish themselves as some of the best on the platform. Atari, of course, were not happy about this, and attempted to use all manner of scare tactics, culminating in a lawsuit claiming that the four had stolen trade secrets, but were mostly unsuccessful. The outcome was that Activision agreed to pay royalties to Atari, but their position as a third-party developer had otherwise been legitimised. Activision's games were high quality, and often very obviously pushed the concept of what a video game could really be forwards. Their games were ambitious and forward-thinking, and the influences of many of them can still be felt to this day. Notably, Activision made a point of crediting the developer with a full page in their manuals, and introduced an early incarnation of what we know today as achievements or trophies, by setting high score challenges. accomplishing a task in a particular game and sending photographic proof to Activision would net you a So-On patch to commemorate your accomplishments. The rise of Activision empowered other third-party developers to start producing games for the Atari 2600, initially resulting in a rich and diverse array of games available for the platform, but ultimately culminating in the market saturation that would lead to the great North American video game crash of 1983. The crash wasn't the direct result of third-party developers arriving on the scene. Rather, it was the result of too many third-party developers seeing what Activision had achieved and wanting a piece of that action. It quickly reached a point where there were simply too many games on the market, and regrettably, this situation snuffed out many of the brightest stars of the fledgling third-party development scene, such as Imagic. For a while, it looked like that might have been it for the Atari 2600. But in 1986, the video game industry in North America was starting to pick itself back up following the launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and a new low-cost model of the Atari 2600 started to find success as an affordable entry-level games machine. Remarkably, the system managed to find relevance once again with a lineup of new games, both from Atari and surviving third-party developers such as Activision. Indeed, many of the latter's most well-regarded popular games such as Pitfall 2, Keystone Capers and Beam Rider were released post-crash, though by the 2600's relaunch in 1986, the company had mostly moved on to development for home computers. Successfully surviving up until 1992, the Atari 2600's remarkable 14-year lifespan provides a potent means of exploring the early days of the video gaming medium, and remains fascinating to explore to this day. If you want an itemised list of why the Atari 2600 is important and why it's worth checking out even now, then here you go. Firstly, it popularised consoles with interchangeable media. It took games beyond digital adaptations of board, card and parlour games. It established the single-player experience. Its library defined the possibilities of what a video game could really be, something we continue to explore to this day. It demonstrated that good gameplay is timeless regardless of technology, something that continues to be explored particularly in the indie space to this day. And of course, the thriving homebrew scene continues to push this humble machine to its absolute limits and beyond, long after its commercial lifespan. The Atari 2600 will always be beloved with very good reason. And if you've always written it off as the old machine with the bad graphics, I urge you to take a bit of time to explore its library. You might just find yourself surprised at how many genuinely enjoyable experiences are out there, just waiting for you to discover them.